The Sahara is not a graveyard. It is a mirror. It reflects our own fragility back at us with blinding, white-hot intensity. We look at the desert and we see nothing. A blank canvas of shifting silica. But the desert has always been a repository for the things humanity would rather forget. Last Thursday, at 3:14 a.m., a server farm in Northern Virginia, running a custom AI topographical model designed to track desertification, pinged a massive, rhythmic anomaly. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a shadow. It was structural. When the researchers overlaid the raw data, the reality of what they were looking at caused a silent panic in the lab. Beneath the Teneré, the land of fear, lay an urban sprawl so geometrically impossible that it defied every convention of North African archaeology. It was a grid. A perfect, sprawling, interconnected grid of basalt stone, obsidian glass conduits, and limestone foundations, buried 30 meters under a shifting sea of dunes. But the real horror wasn't the existence of the city, it was the state of it. If you study the collapse of Rome, you find a slow decay, the rotting of institutions, the depletion of resources, the gradual, agonizing retreat. If you study the Mayan collapse, you find the symptoms of drought and societal fracturing. But this defies the archaeological record. Soil samples taken from the living quarters of the site show a complete lack of transitional debris. There are no layers of ash from a fire, no broken weapons from a siege, no piles of bones that suggest a sudden massacre. There is only the mundane, frozen moment of a life interrupted. We found plates of unconsumed food, calcified by the centuries, still sitting on stone tables. We found children's stone-carved toys lying in the middle of courtyards, abandoned mid-play. The city did not fall. It was abandoned. And every carbon-dated sample we have pulled from the perimeter suggests the window of departure was less than 24 hours. Imagine the atmosphere. It is the height of a scorching Saharan summer. The markets are full. The water systems, which we now know were powered by a subterranean aquifer that has been dry for 4 millennia, are flowing. The people are working, laughing, trading. And then, between one sunrise and the next, they left. They didn't pack. They didn't say goodbye to their homes. They walked into the dunes, and they never came back. What is it that drives a civilization to walk away from their life's work? What is it that creates a mass psychosis of such precision that an entire metropolis, a city of perhaps 50,000 souls, simply ceases to exist? To understand the why, we have to look at the what. The architecture of this city. Let's call it Ethelgard, for the sake of classification, does not fit into any known Berber or Egyptian lineage. The masonry is too precise. The stones are joined without mortar, fused at the molecular level using a heat treatment process that shouldn't have been invented for another 2,000 years. But as we mapped the city, a pattern emerged. The city is laid out in a series of concentric circles, radiating outward from a central spire. This is common in ancient urban planning. It mirrors the heavens, the sun, the cycles of time. But look closer at the outermost ring. The houses don't face outward toward the desert. They face inward. Every door, every window, every defensive structure was built to prevent something from entering. Or perhaps to keep something from escaping. We sent a micro-drone into one of the residential dwellings. The dust was thick, a fine metallic silt that clogged the sensors. Inside, the walls were covered in frantic, repetitive carvings. They weren't historical accounts. They weren't records of kings or gods. They were warnings. The recurring symbol is a distorted eye, not a human eye, but something jagged, something that looks less like anatomy and more like a tear in the fabric of the stone itself. There is a theory, whispered in the back rooms of the archaeological community, that the desert doesn't just hide cities, it hides the consequences of civilization. What if Aethelgard didn't run out of water? What if they were running from a realization? A truth about the environment they were living in that they finally understood too late. We must consider the environment. 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. It was a savanna, a paradise of lakes and grasses. But this climate shift was violent. The African humid period did not end gracefully. It was a climate collapse of terrifying speed. But looking at the geological strata surrounding the city, we found something that shouldn't be there. Thin, microscopic layers of radioactive salt. This isn't from a modern nuclear event. This is natural, but highly localized. As the groundwater evaporated, it concentrated minerals from the deep crust, releasing gases that we are only now beginning to understand. Gases that, when inhaled in high concentrations, cause hallucinations, paranoia, and a state of heightened, terrifying clarity. Could the abandonment be a mass exodus driven by a hallucination? Imagine a city waking up to find that the air itself has become poison. The wind begins to carry a sound, a high-pitched, metallic whistle caused by the shifting dunes acting as natural organ pipes. To a people who didn't understand acoustics, this was the sound of the world ending. They fled. But they didn't flee to safety. They fled into the shifting sands, where the desert finished what the air started. If we abandon the clinical comfort of climate science, we are forced to stare into the abyss of the horror legend perspective. And frankly, the evidence supports this view with a chilling consistency. When we entered the central spire, the structure that anchored the entire concentric layout of the city. We didn't find a library, or a throne room, or a treasury. We found a silence that felt heavy, almost pressurized. The walls of this spire are lined with a substance that our initial analysis describes as vitrified sand. It is black, translucent, and incredibly cold to the touch, even in the middle of a Saharan afternoon. It's as if the sand was subjected to an instantaneous, localized blast of heat so intense it skipped the liquid phase and turned directly into a glass-like solid.
But here is where the legend takes hold. Carved into this vitrified glass are the final entries of the people who stayed behind, the ones who didn't run. The syntax is archaic, a proto-language that we are still struggling to map, but the intent is agonizingly clear. They weren't writing about hunger. They weren't writing about the end of the rain. They were writing about a watcher. One inscription, repeated 400 times in a frantic, overlapping scrawl, translates roughly to, "The dunes have eyes that do not see. They only hunger for the reflection of our intent."
This changes everything. It suggests that Aethelgard wasn't just a place to live. It was a psychological experiment in architecture. The citizens believed, perhaps with good reason, that their own thoughts, their collective anxiety, and their desperate hope for survival were acting as a beacon for something buried even deeper than the city itself. The eye symbol I mentioned earlier? It isn't an eye. It's a mapping of a focal point. A point where the desert's electromagnetic hum, that metallic whistle I mentioned, converges with human consciousness.
Think about the implications. We, as modern humans, spend our lives plugged into digital grids, surrounded by constant low-frequency electrical hums from our devices. We are always connected. The inhabitants of Aethelgard were doing the same, but using the earth itself. They were tuning in to the frequency of the planet. And they accidentally tuned into something else. Something that was already here, waiting beneath the silica. Something that had been hibernating since before the first dunes were ever formed. The 24-hour abandonment wasn't a choice. It was an involuntary flight response triggered by a collective realization. Imagine 50,000 people in the span of a single day, all simultaneously sensing that they were no longer alone in their own minds. They didn't pack their bags because they were already running. They were being pushed out by a presence that demanded the city be cleared. It wasn't a migration. It was a harvest of space. And when they left, the city didn't just go quiet. It went dark. It entered a state of hibernation, waiting for the next civilization to stumble upon the grid, build their own homes, and begin the process of tuning the frequency all over again.
We are currently looking at the aerial scans of the peripheral outposts, and we have found a pattern we missed the first time. The outposts aren't random. They are arranged in a massive, sprawling sigil, a pattern designed to dampen the signal from the central spire.
They weren't just living in the city. They were trying to keep the Watcher asleep. And when that effort failed, when the signal became too loud to ignore, they didn't just leave. They erased their own history, hoping that if they forgot their own names, the Watcher would lose track of them in the endless, shifting indifference of the dunes. We are not just uncovering a lost city. We are triggering the alarm.
The final, terrifying piece of the puzzle isn't in the past. It's in the code. After we released the initial findings of Site Zero, the AI that discovered it, the very same model that flagged the grid, began to exhibit a strange behavior. It started rejecting the input data. It began classifying the geometric patterns of the city not as urban architecture, but as noise. When our engineers tried to force the model to render a 3D reconstruction of the central spire, the system crashed. Not a software error, a hardware failure. The processors in our server, capable of simulating the birth of galaxies, were physically burned out in seconds.
We are not just looking at a graveyard of the past. We are looking at a system that is still active. The inhabitants of Ethelgard didn't leave because of a drought. They left because they realized they were living inside a battery, a machine designed to harness human consciousness to keep something trapped beneath the crust. And when they realized the machine was waking up, they walked into the dunes, choosing to die of thirst rather than serve as fuel for whatever was stirring in the dark. So here we are, a team of 21st century scientists, armed with satellite eyes and digital precision, peering into the tomb of a people who were smart enough to run, but not fast enough to escape. We call it history. We call it discovery. But maybe we should call it a warning. The Sahara is shifting. The dunes are moving, revealing these stones one by one. The signal, that high-frequency hum that the ancients carved into their walls, is being picked up by our own satellites, our own GPS, our own global infrastructure. We are more connected to the grid than they ever were. To dream loud enough, to wake it up again. We believe we are the masters of the desert, the ones who finally conquered the silence. But every time I look at those satellite images, that perfect, haunting grid hidden beneath the sand, I don't see a ruin. I see an open door. We are not discovering the past. We are inviting it back.
Don't forget to subscribe and keep your eyes on the horizon. The sand is shifting, and for the first time in 5,000 years, the city is starting to wake up.